Somewhere in Johannesburg, in the winter of 2016, a young man sat with his phone and typed out a list of people he wanted dead. He was careful about it, and he was specific. Diplomats at the American and British missions, a cartoonist who had once drawn the Prophet, wealthy Jewish businessmen, and a gay imam he couldn't yet name. He believed he was talking to a brother in the Islamic State, someone who could wire him money and teach him how to build a bomb. What he didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, was that the man reading every word on the other end of that chat was an undercover American agent, sitting thousands of miles away and writing all of it down. His name was Tony-Lee Thulsie. He was 23 years old and he had an identical twin brother named Brandon-Lee. By the time this story ends, those two will have made history as the first South Africans ever charged over links to ISIS, spent nearly 6 years in a cell without ever standing trial, landed on a United States terror blacklist, and then, on the very morning their trial was finally due to begin, stood up in the Johannesburg High Court and pleaded guilty. And the judge who sentenced them will say out loud from the bench that these two young men were baited. To understand how a boy from Newclare ends up typing out that list, you have to go back a lot further than 2016.
Let's take a look at this news just in. This is out of the court in Johannesburg. The state says it has a strong case against the Thulsie twins, who are accused of terrorism. It told the Johannesburg Magistrates Court that the brothers were intent on carrying out attacks on behalf of the Islamic State. Prosecutors say Tony-Lee Thulsie was planning to blow himself up, and that his brother, Brandon-Lee, tried twice to fly to Syria to join ISIS, and that he received funding from a member of the terror group. This is news just in out of the Johannesburg Magistrates Court.
Newclare is a working-class suburb on the west side of Johannesburg. Tight streets, small houses, the kind of place where everyone knows whose son is whose. The twins were 3 years old when their father was killed, and their mother, Wasila, raised them on her own. The background that was eventually placed before the court described what followed as a hard childhood, but not a loveless one. And if you want proof of that, you only have to look at who filled the public gallery in every single court appearance for the next 6 years. The people who knew them as teenagers described two ordinary Joburg boys. A neighbor who went to school with them told the Sunday Times they were perfectly normal at school, outgoing and social. They played sport, they had girlfriends. Brandon-Lee had a go at getting into film casting, and the two of them DJ'd, playing music at parties. The account later given on their behalf in court said much the same thing in blunter language, that they were teenagers discovering girls, going out, and not much interested in school. Brandon-Lee's Facebook page from those years is a young man's page, club nights and break dances and mates messing around, and it stops dead in the middle of 2016. Somewhere in there, they found religion, and this is one of the places where the record splits. The background read into court says the brothers accepted Islam at 14. The version the neighbors and the security services worked from puts the real conversion in 2013, when they were about 20, alongside their close friend, Ronaldo Smith. Both can be true and probably are. A boy is drawn to something at 14, and years later, out of school and looking for a direction, he goes all the way in. Because that's what everyone around them saw. They took new names, Brandon-Lee becoming Salahuddin, Tony-Lee becoming Yakin. Their family, a mix of Muslims and Christians, accepted it without much fuss, and a relative later said that at first it seemed like a good thing. Then the change kept going. They stopped partying, stopped clubbing, stopped DJing. They walked away from their old friends and started giving away their possessions. They stopped talking, and they got secretive. What they wanted, according to the account given to the court, was to go and live somewhere they could live under Islamic law, and live what they thought would be a perfect life. In 2015, at the height of the caliphate, when the propaganda was slick and everywhere and aimed squarely at exactly this kind of young man, there was only one place that was advertising itself as that. And so they decided to leave.
Well, my brothers, come to jihad and feel the honor we are feeling, feel the happiness that we are feeling.
This new and very glossy recruitment video, which looks professionally shot and edited, was produced by ISIS in English. It's tailor-made to appeal to Americans and other Western jihadists. It features a 20-year-old British medical student who's traveled to Syria to wage jihad.
What prevents you from attaining martyrdom and the pleasure of your Lord? Look around you while you sit in comfort and ask yourself, is this how you want to die?
Analysts fear strategies like this may be working.
In April 2015, Brandon-Lee, Tony-Lee, and Ronaldo Smith saved up what they had, drove out to OR Tambo International Airport, and tried to board a Qatar Airways flight to Turkey, planning to cross the border into Syria on the other side. They never got on the plane. The airline had been tipped off, and here is the detail that sits heavier the further you get into this story. The tip came from their own family. Their family told the authorities what the boys were planning, and the boys were stopped at the gate. Think about that for a second. The people who loved them most tried to save them by grounding them. And staying in South Africa may have been the very thing that pulled them in deeper. They tried again. The lead investigator, a Hawks warrant officer named Vainant Olivia, later told a magistrate's court that border officials flagged the trio a second time, crossing into Mozambique with a fourth man, heading for Maputo and a flight out from there. The Hawks, by the way, are South Africa's elite priority crimes unit, the ones handed the cases too big or too sensitive for an ordinary station. That attempt failed too. And in August that year, the twins turned up at the Vicksburg border post on the Lesotho border, carrying passports in two names that weren't theirs: Christian Adam Leroy and Jermaine Adams Troy. That would eventually become a fraud charge on the indictment, and it tells you something. 3 attempts in 5 months. They were desperate to get out. They came home broke. Brandon-Lee went back to his job at Discovery, one of the country's biggest financial services companies, to try to save the money up again. And it's here, in that gap between wanting to leave and not being able to, that the story turns. Because from August 2015, according to the indictment, Tony-Lee started talking to people online. He used the name Simba. On Telegram, he made contact with someone linked to the Islamic State, and with others the state admitted it never managed to identify. And the instructions coming back to him read like a wish list of a nightmare. Attack Western interests in South Africa. Kill the cartoonist Zapiro, who had drawn the Prophet Muhammad years before. Kill Jews who'd served in the Israeli army and come home. Kill wealthy Jews. The charge sheet listed the targets that were put to him, and the list ran long. King David High School in Linksfield, the UK High Commission, the American and Russian embassies, a French diplomat, a Jewish investment banker, the state arms manufacturer Denal, Jewish community events, and foreigners moving through the airports. Years later, Zapiro would describe the moment the Hawks came and told him he'd been on that list. He said it was pretty scary to hear that 2 young converts had discussed killing him with small arms or explosives or poison. Then, in May and June of 2016, Tony-Lee started talking to someone new. Someone who could actually get him what he needed, who could send money, who knew about detonators. He thought he'd found a real operative. He'd found an undercover American agent, described in most of the court reporting as FBI, though the twins' own lawyer would later insist it was the CIA. Whoever the man's employer was, the moment he started typing, every word Tony-Lee sent was going into a file. Olivier told the court that a foreign intelligence agency warned the Hawks that Simba was planning an imminent attack, that this was the 5th alert they'd received about him, and that this one worried them because it involved Tony-Lee asking a senior Islamic State figure for permission to strike. It had become clear, Olivier said, that the young man was building an explosive device and was just looking for a trigger to set it off. So they went and got a search warrant.
The state says it has a strong case against the Thulsie twins. Tony-Lee and Brandon-Lee Thulsie are facing terrorism charges. The state presented pictures of the brothers wearing what it's claimed was suicide vests.
Saturday, the 9th of July, 2016. At 7 that morning, their sister Salome McClure was waiting for the good morning message her mother sent every day, and it hadn't come. By 8, there was still nothing, so she rang, and her mother's phone was off. She rang Salahuddin's phone because he lived with their mum, and his was off too. In an account she published 2 years later, she described what happened next. She got in her car and drove over, still telling herself there was a normal explanation, and when she turned into her mother's road, she saw yellow police tape across it, police vehicles outside the house, and a van that looked to her like a mortuary van. She was so panicked getting out of the car that she forgot the handbrake and had to jump back in as it rolled. She ran, and her legs gave out under her, and she fell in the road. Armed men shouted at her to stop. She begged them until they let her through, and when she got to the house, the front door was lying broken and her mother was sitting on the couch in tears, in a home that had been turned upside down, cupboards emptied, furniture pulled apart. "Where is Salahuddin?" she asked. "They took him," her mother said. And then, "I had to beg them to give him a jacket." A few suburbs over, the same thing was happening at the cottage where Tony-Lee was living with his wife of 2 months, a woman named Adila. And out in Azadville, near Krugersdorp, officers arrested a brother and sister, Ibrahim and Fatima Patel, on charges that had nothing to do with terrorism, possession of a stun grenade and 21 rounds of ammunition, which their lawyer said Ibrahim had held onto from his time in the Community Policing Forum and simply never handed back. They got bail of 5,000 Rand each, about $350 at the time. Hold on to their names, we'll come back to them. What police said they found in the twins' homes was damning. Handwritten notes on how to join the Islamic State and how to build a bomb. And photographs. Photographs of young men holding what looked like automatic rifles, and photographs of them wearing what officers described as a suicide vest. Those images went around the world within days, and this is where the first crack appears in the state's clean story. The family looked at the same photographs and said the police had it completely wrong. Those were old pictures of boys, they said, teenagers messing about with what could just as easily be toy guns, one relative describing a bomb belt as a prop from a paintball afternoon. And the defense would go on to argue that for all the raids and all the surveillance, no explosives, no detonators, and no weapons were ever recovered. It's the kind of claim that's easy to scoff at and easy to believe, depending on which version of these two men you've already decided is true. That gap between the terrifying version and the naive version never closes in this case. Not at trial, because there wasn't one. Not in the plea, because half of it stayed sealed. They appeared in the Johannesburg Magistrates Court days later in grey hooded tracksuits under black thorbs, looking, in the words of one reporter in the room, crestfallen. Their mother sat in the gallery with one of their sisters. The case was postponed. They were remanded into custody. And that custody turned out to be the real story, because almost nobody in that room would have guessed those two would still be sitting in a cell, untried, nearly 6 years later. The delays started early and never stopped. First, the defense attacked the arrest itself as unlawful. Then, in September 2017, the case took on a weight that a Johannesburg terrorism matter almost never carries, when the United States government formally designated Tony-Lee and Brandon-Lee Thulsie as specially designated global terrorists, froze whatever assets they might have had, and put 2 young men from the West Rand on the same blacklist as career jihadists. The stated aim was to deny them the resources to carry out an attack.
And the United States has placed the South African Thulsie twins, Brandon-Lee and Tony-Lee Thulsie, on its terror blacklist. Being placed on the U.S. terror list means authorities can seize the Thulsie twins' assets, if any, in the U.S., including bank accounts, properties, etc. Designated terrorists liable for arrest in countries that recognize U.S. global terrorist list. All American citizens are barred from conducting any transactions with banned entities. U.S. cuts off all financial access to the designated terrorists. The key question here is, has the U.S. jumped the gun by not waiting for the South African court's verdict on the Thulsie twins' culpability?
Back at home, the case just would not move. There were fights over whether the matter belonged in the regional court or the High Court. There was a challenge to the constitutionality of the terrorism law itself. There were postponements while the state waited on evidence from foreign agencies, evidence that partly lived inside American intelligence files that were never going to be handed over easily. The twins abandoned bail early on, then launched a fresh application in 2020 and lost, because terrorism sits in what South African law calls Schedule 6, the most serious category, where the accused has to show exceptional circumstances before release will even be considered. And the years just kept going. Their mother came every Friday to the prison, come rain or shine, carrying bags of food she could barely afford, sometimes alone, sometimes too sick to be doing it. She lost her house because Salahuddin had been the one supporting her and moved in with her daughter. Tony-Lee's wife saw him through bars. The court appearances became the only place the family could touch them, and even then the brothers came in shackled. Muslim civil society groups, the Media Review Network and the advocacy organisation CAGE kept saying the same thing to anyone who'd listen. 5 years in a cell, without a trial, in a country whose constitution was written by people who'd been detained without trial themselves. If the state couldn't bring its case, it should let them go. And the judges were losing patience too. When the defense asked in late 2021 for the trial to be pushed to March, Judge Ramaruma Monama refused, calling the request preposterous and reminding the room that what was at stake wasn't legal niceties, but whether people can be held that long at all. Meanwhile, something had happened to the third man, and almost nobody noticed. Ronaldo Smith, the friend who'd converted with them and tried to fly to Turkey with them, was never charged. When the Hawks raided his home, he gave them a statement about who Simba was and what he was planning, and he told Olivia something else, which is that he'd got out of that life himself, and that he tried to talk the Thulsies out of it, and failed. He became a state witness. Then he turned down witness protection, and he vanished. In May 2018, a photograph started circulating among Islamic State supporters on Telegram, taken in a field in northern Mozambique, a group of armed men posing under the black flag in Cabo Delgado, where an insurgency was just beginning to burn. The state told the court that one of the men in that photograph was Ronaldo Smith. A later research report said sources believed he'd since been killed fighting there, though that has never been officially confirmed. The state witness who told police he'd got out had gone to war, and the two men he tried to talk out of it were the ones sitting in Kosi Mampuru prison. By January 2022, the court had had enough and ordered the trial to start on the 7th of February. On the first day of trial, the Thulsie twins walked into the Johannesburg High Court wearing kaffirs, and instead of fighting, they pleaded guilty. After almost 6 years of insisting they'd done nothing, after the applications and the appeals and the campaigns, they'd cut a deal. In South African law, it's called a plea and sentence agreement, where the accused and the prosecutor agree on both the plea and the sentence, and the judge decides whether to accept it. 12 charges came down to 3. Both brothers pleaded guilty to attempting to leave the country to join ISIL in Syria and got 5 years each for it. Brandon-Lee pleaded guilty to possessing a document connected to terrorism, an e-book with the flatly practical title of How to Survive in the West, a Mujahid guide which teaches everything from making explosives to evading the agencies looking for you, and got 3 years on top. And Tony-Lee, the one who'd done the talking, pleaded guilty to conspiring with a man known only as Abu Harb to attack diplomats, embassies, and Jewish interests in South Africa, including his own admission that he'd intended to blow himself up in the attack. That got him 6 more.
After 6 long years behind bars, the Thulsie twins have finally been convicted and sentenced. The twins, who were arrested back in 2016, pleaded guilty to trying to leave South Africa to join the Islamic State in Syria. And ENC's Heidi Jockus tells us more about the sentencing.
Brandon-Lee Thulsie has been sentenced to 8 years in prison, while his twin brother Tony-Lee will serve 11 years. The 5 years and 7 months the twins have already served will count towards time served. Both pleaded guilty to attempting to travel to Syria twice in 2015 to join Islamic State in Iraq in order to conduct terrorist activities. They also pleaded guilty to downloading ISIL literature from the internet, including instructions on how to acquire weapons and make bombs. Tony-Lee Thulsie pleaded guilty to the additional charge of conspiracy to commit terrorist attacks in South Africa.
11 and 8 years each, both backdated to the day of their arrest, which meant that after the arithmetic, Brandon-Lee had roughly 2 years left and Tony-Lee about 5. The prosecution explained that in agreeing to those numbers, the prosecution had weighed something that mattered. No attack ever happened, and when the twins were arrested, they weren't holding any explosives or any detonators. There was a plan, an intent, and terrible words in a chat log. There was no bomb. Then Judge Mokgatleng gave his reasons, and they were not what anyone in the gallery expected. He said, "This court does not punish people for their beliefs or their faith, only for conduct that becomes criminal." And having read the plea and sentence agreement, the part the public never got to see, he said that the boys were baited, the boys were controlled, and that they had been conspired against by their own friends, and that it was only through their association with a criminal that they'd been convicted at all. So who was Abu Harb? Nobody outside that sealed agreement can say. A genuine conspirator? The undercover American under another name? Something worse, an operative who supplied the plan, the targets, and the encouragement to two young men who might never have built any of it alone? The defense argued exactly that this was an unlawful trap under South African law, that money was sent, that requests were made, and that you cannot bait a person into a crime he wouldn't otherwise have committed. The state's answer was simpler. The boys said yes. They asked for the bomb. They named the targets. They wrote it down. Both of those things can be true at once, and that's what makes this case so uncomfortable. 6 months later, on the 18th of August 2022, the parole board released the Thulsie twins. The time served calculation had already carried both past their minimum detention periods, and they went home into their family's custody, into house arrest at first, with reporting conditions, permission needed for religious activities, and a window on a Sunday morning when they were allowed out of the house. Their lawyer said they were ready to get on with their lives. And that's what they did. In the 4 years since, there have been no new charges, no incidents, nothing in the papers. Brandon-Lee's 8 years ran out in July 2024. Tony-Lee's 11 have less than a year left on them, which leaves the loose ends, and this case has more than most. Ronaldo Smith, the friend who converted with them in Newclare and then told police he'd got out, is believed to have died in a forest in Cabo Delgado. Abu Harb was never identified in public and never will be. And Fatima Patel, the young woman picked up in Azadville on that same July weekend on a charge about a stun grenade and 21 bullets, walked out on bail and went to KwaZulu-Natal. In February 2018, she was arrested again with her husband over the disappearance of an elderly British South African couple who'd gone into a coastal forest looking for rare seeds. This June, more than 8 years later, a Durban court convicted her, and in July she was sentenced to double life. So of the people whose doors came in that weekend in July 2016, one is thought to be dead, one is serving life for a double murder, and 2 are at home in Johannesburg after serving 6 years. They were 23 when the Hawks came through the door, and 29 when they got out. What they would have done if the man on the other end of that chat had been who they thought he was, is a question the plea deal made certain would never be answered in open court. And the country they talked about attacking still isn't sure what it caught or what it let go.